Welcome to Notepad. Again, this is one of the final few episodes where we have to work from home before we return back to the comforts of our studio. But in the meantime, we continue on the conversation of COVID-19 and the speed of recovery. Very recently, the ICAEW, or the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, have published a statement or a report arguing that Southeast Asian economies, including that of Malaysia, will see some sort of a recession, and but the growth of recovery will take place next year. And the issue here, of course, is what would be some of the impetus that would result in that growth of recovery, and whether or not the growth of recovery is the same for everyone in this part of the world. So joining us is Sian Fenner of ICAEW, calling us from Tasmania, Australia, quite a world apart, to be frank. Sian, again, thanks for spending time with us. Let's go through a little bit about the report before we deep dive into the details of it.
Okay, so what our view is that, well, of course, the global coronavirus pandemic, is delivering the largest economic shock to the region since the Asia financial crisis. In fact, actually, we already saw that growth slowed significantly, turned negative for most of the Southeast Asian economies on a quarterly basis, and we believe that currently we are in a technical recession.
And of course, this is impacting not just Southeast Asia, but all the other countries around the world, particularly when we know that Southeast Asia trades a lot with a lot of other countries. Would this case be the same, therefore, for other countries, particularly highly traded ones with Southeast Asia, for instance, the EU, China, US, and the likes?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing deep contractions across most of the advanced economies and those economies that Southeast Asia does trade with. So there's two factors which are impacting economic growth. One is, of course, the domestic lockdowns within each country. The more stringent these lockdowns, the greater impact that is having on discretionary consumption. So what households can do. Obviously, no one can go out to restaurants or anything at the moment. But adding to that as well is that with this weak import demand, the fact we're getting some global supply chain disruptions, that also means that those countries which are more export dependent, countries such as Singapore and even Malaysia to a degree, they are also getting that double whammy of that sort of weak import demand, with these countries being in recession themselves.
Some of the people that I speak to over the past few days are actually concerned about consumption. You're right. And consumption, domestic consumption, is going to take a huge impact. No matter how much we try to argue that, home delivery kind of thing is, supplementing the economy sufficiently, it's not, because as you rightfully put it, domestic consumption in shopping malls, buying products physically en masse, at least for wholesale and retail, all that is going to be impacted. And I don't see things picking up, at least in the near term, because another research report that I read by Ipsos argues that Malaysia is one of the more concerned countries, a more reserved country in terms of trying to get our feet back into the marketplace, because we are extremely concerned about the COVID pandemic, and therefore we are not really intermingling with the public and in public spaces and stuff like that. Do you think that this consumption shrinkage is really going to impact our path of recovery, at least in the report that you mentioned for the growth of next year?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors here. One is the fact that, as you said, we've had these shopping malls being shut, we've had restaurants being shut. So when you have zero activity and then you start seeing some activity, that will give you automatically a temporary boost. But how much that could be continue as we go into the fourth quarter, so the last 3 months of the year, and into 2021, will very much depend on how households actually feel, both in terms of labour market concerns, so that's employment, income, and how actually households do actually feel whether or not the coronavirus outbreak has been contained sufficiently. And those countries where they do actually have more concern, that confidence, that sentiment is probably going to dampen any kind of recovery that we do see on the consumer side.
All right, let's splice and dice the countries that are mentioned in the report. How does Malaysia stack up with the rest of the other countries in the report?
Okay, it's probably around about the middle. So there's a couple of factors that we take into consideration for this. One is how they've contained the virus, how successful that has been. One is actually how they're going to move out of the the lockdown. So how restrictions are being eased and how households and businesses respond to that. Also, there's on the export side, as well as the fact that whether or not we actually the monetary policy and fiscal policy response. So within that, we sort of place Malaysia a little bit in the middle. We've obviously seen that sort of recent sort of spike up in numbers, but we are seeing some easing restrictions, and we've seen like workplace mobility start to pick up. So that should provide some support. And as we see that sort of global easing in restrictions, that should also support the recovery in exports that we're expecting for next year. So we're looking, though, still for a fairly hefty contraction. It's down about 3.1% on the year this year, then growing above 7% next year. So that puts it fairly in the middle. It's not doing as well as Vietnam, which is one of the countries we do see as being one of the only country out of this group that's going to record positive growth, but it's not doing as badly as Singapore or Thailand, that are more export dependent or service, tourism dependent as than Malaysia.
This does expose the risk of being a purely service-oriented economy, because, as you say, if things do go south, it really goes south very, very bad for these kind of economies. Do you think that the diversification of economy is really important now, and the call for diversifying economy, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, whatever, right? It's not just about services any longer as we thought it would be previously, to make ourselves a little bit more developed, a little bit more, in terms of a little bit more rich even. Do you think that diversifying economy is going to be a big deal now moving forward?
I think it's hard. I mean, this one, compared to any of the other sort of crises we've experienced, the global financial crisis, the Asia financial crisis, this is very much a service sector. It's obviously impacted the manufacturing side, but it's very much the service sector. It's unprecedented where we've seen these kind of lockdowns. It is important. It's usually a part of the growth path as a country becomes more advanced, that you do see the services side increase importance. If you also think about a country as they're sort of aging, now Malaysia relative still has sort of fairly favourable demographics, but it is going to be aging. So that means, health's going to become more important. Education's still going to become important. And it's those other factors, logistics, which obviously, as we see robotics and AI, that means services is still going to be an important component. Of course, moving up the value-added chain in manufacturing is also going to be, important of the resilience against these kind of shocks, as well as making sure that Malaysia returns to having that sort of macro buffers in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy, after we exit sort of this lockdown, this pandemic recession that we're seeing globally.
Reading the report, ICAEW argues that the average growth is going to be 8%. And that's kind of, while it's good reading it at face value, it's kind of interesting to see which countries are growing really fast, because 8% average means that's the middle. So I assume that there are countries that are going to outpace everybody else, double digits even.
We're not seeing really double digits, but you're right, there are going to be countries that perform better. Singapore will be one of them, but they're also experiencing negative 6%. So that's a large contraction. And if we actually look at it compared to sort of 2019, or even if we think about sort of pre-coronavirus, this rebound that we're expecting in 2021 will still mean that GDP levels will actually be lost. So we're still seeing some permanent loss, even with this fairly strong rebound that we're expecting next year. So it's really coming from that sort of very low base, that big contraction, particularly in Q2, which is just going to be dire numbers across the board.
So there's a lot of literature out there in terms of the shapes of recovery, V-shape, W-shape, swish, swoosh, all those kind of recovery is still, in my mind, optimistic, because they're all showing a dip, they're all showing something to be increased. At the end of the day, what would be some of the risks and opportunities that we can see moving forward when we talk about recovery? What would be some of the key factors that we need to think about when we want to see some sort of recovery for any country, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, or anywhere else around the world?
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that while we're expecting sort of the Q3, so after June, so going into July to the August numbers, that we're expecting that should bounce back. But I mean, what we want is a sustained recovery. And of course, the key risk is that we get a second wave. And with the second wave, we also then get another round of lockdowns. Now, our sort of view is generally is that if we do, we're probably going to see periods where we do see these spikes in cases the number of cases, increase in COVID cases. But what will happen, it might become more local. So any shutdowns will become a little bit more local, not a national shutdown. Now, that regardless of that, it would actually still mean that any kind of recovery that we do have next year will be significantly impacted and will be quite costly. It's going to have a bigger impact, another big round of impact on business investment, consumption, as people get concerned that this is not going to be ending anytime soon. We're not going to be getting that recovery. So employment concerns and external demand concerns will wait. So that's the key risk that we're seeing going forward. Now, on the other side, though, there is the upside. It may be a small probability, but if we do move to a situation where we do have a cure for the virus, and with this vaccine, that would mean that we could actually see more opening. That would be opening up the tourism sector, which even with this sort of easing in restrictions globally, is unlikely to return to any kind of form of normality anytime soon. But if we did see that, that would be a positive. I think we should also add is that, of course, we've had a lot of fiscal and monetary policy support. Governments, monetary authorities have coordinated their responses, both within the Southeast Asia region and globally, and that's going to be, quite conducive for a recovery. It's dampened the impact a little bit now, and it's going to be quite conducive for the recovery that we're expecting in 2021.
On that point, do you think that governments need to do more in terms of monetary and fiscal policy? Do you think that they need to increase liquidity domestically? Do you think that they need to lower the interest rate even further? What do you think needs to be done more for governments around the world? And perhaps if you know a little bit about Malaysia, what can the governments of Malaysia do in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy as well?
Yeah, so we've seen quite a lot of obviously fiscal policy, both particularly in Malaysia. The third package means that in total that it's about 20% of GDP. Now, within that, there's some direct fiscal measures, and there's also measures which are in coordination with the monetary authority to improve liquidity. Now, we don't see a lot of countries having a lot of extra fiscal space going forward, and even some countries have some limited monetary policy space. And I would probably argue that Malaysia is one of those countries which probably does not have a lot of fiscal space to actually continue to increase direct spending. Now, it can always continue to provide liquidity. We'd expect that, particularly for SMEs, but it probably doesn't have a lot of room to continue with direct spending. Now, it was already in a situation where you've got lower oil prices. Obviously, revenues are going to be hit hard, not just from the oil prices, but from lower consumption. And it does start raising that question about, well, it's not on that fiscal consolidation path. What will credit agencies actually take on board with this? This last fiscal package didn't include any kind of revenue enhancing measures. So I think they don't have a lot of space to actually to provide more government support. Now, on the monetary policy side, though, they are in a fortunate position with interest rate, the policy rate being at 2%, inflation actually, moving in this sort of deflation, if you like. They've got some policy space to cut interest rates further. So we're looking for at least another 50 basis points on that area. And that will start, alleviating some of those liquidity constraints as well for SMEs and businesses and households.
All right, final question. Do you think that this pandemic has reshaped how we do things moving forward? We've never had anything like this before. How do you think countries around the world can actually learn from this and pick ourselves up moving forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, as you said, we haven't been in this situation anytime soon. I suppose the closest is actually Asia did have SARS, and so we did see some countries that have, because of their SARS experience, have had some relatively more success in actually containing the outbreak and being able to move in, not having the restrictions that other more advanced economies that haven't experienced this. I think going forward, it will be a matter. We're not going to be returning to normality anytime soon. As I said, international travel. That's going to be an interesting thing to see how that's actually going to progress.
That's gone.
It is.
It's a nostalgic.
Don't plan any holidays, but it's going to be. I think we're now going to see there's going to be something in place that governments have in place for this occurring again, so that they can act swiftly and actually ensure that they don't need to have this period of waiting too long, if you like, for 3 months of lockdown. So it'll be it's having that sort of plan in place that will be something that will be different going forward. And I think we are in a situation where more social distancing is. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. Is this our new normal as well?
Right, Sian, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us. That was Sian Fenner of ICAEW. That wraps up our show for this evening. Catch you next time. Goodbye.